When Your Life Becomes Honest, Chapter 1. When the call came, Thomas almost didn't recognize her voice. Not because it had changed, because some part of him had spent 18 years trying to erase the exact sound of it saying his name. "Are you alone?" Evelyn asked. He looked through the darkened house toward the bedroom where his wife was sleeping with the television still on. Then he closed the study door with extraordinary care. "Yes," he said. The lie entered the room quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas sat down at his desk, though he had no memory of deciding to. Outside, rain pressed softly against the windows. The maple tree in the yard moved under the porch light like something underwater. He became aware of his own breathing. Too shallow, too fast. "You still hesitate before answering difficult questions," Evelyn said. He leaned back in his chair. "And you still begin conversations in the middle. That's because beginnings are usually dishonest." He shut his eyes. 18 years vanished with terrifying ease. Not vanished, exactly. Folded, like a letter reopened. "How did you get this number?" he asked. "A mutual friend. We don't have mutual friends anymore." "No," she said. "I suppose we don't." There it was again. That tone. Calm on the surface. Something wounded moving beneath it. In the bedroom, the television laughed suddenly at some distant joke. Thomas listened for movement from his wife and heard none. "What do you want, Evelyn?" A long pause. Then, quietly, "I'm in Boston." He stared at the books lining the wall across from him. Histories. Biographies. Novels he kept promising himself he would reread after retirement. All the careful architecture of a stable life. "When did you get here?" "This afternoon, and you called me tonight." "Yes. Why?" Another silence, but this one felt inhabited. Finally, she said, "Because my husband died in February, and I discovered, to my embarrassment, that you were still the person I wanted to speak to when something terrible happened." Thomas lowered his eyes. There are moments in late adulthood when emotion becomes physically indistinguishable from illness. A tightening in the chest, heat in the face, the strange instability of the hands. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the desk until it hurt. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you. How long was he ill?" 6 months. That's fast." "Yes." The word disappeared almost before it was spoken. Thomas remembered meeting Walter once, a charity dinner in New York. A tall man with restrained manners and beautiful posture. The kind of man who seemed born already understanding expensive restaurants and grief etiquette and where to place his hands during photographs. Evelyn had married him a year after leaving Thomas, or after Thomas let her leave, depending on which version of history one preferred. "I read the obituary," he heard himself say. "You did? It was on mine. You searched for me." "No." The answer came too quickly. Evelyn let the silence expose him. "I search for you sometimes," she admitted. "Not often, once every year or two, just enough to confirm you still exist." He almost smiled despite himself. "That sounds healthy. It isn't." The rain intensified briefly against the glass. Thomas loosened his tie and stood. He crossed to a small cabinet beside the bookshelf and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon. His doctor had advised against whiskey after 9. His doctor was not presently on the telephone with a woman he had once nearly destroyed his life for. "You still drink that awful bourbon?" Evelyn asked. He froze. "You remember the sound?" "I remember everything." The room seemed to tilt slightly. He sat again. "How are your daughters?" she asked. "Grown. That happens. Anna teaches music in Chicago now. Rebecca lives in Portland. She's an architect. You sound proud." "I am." "And your wife?" There it was. Not jealousy. Not quite curiosity either. The unavoidable presence of another person standing silently inside the conversation. "Laura's well," he said carefully. Evelyn made a small sound that could have meant anything. Thomas looked at the wedding photograph on the corner of his desk. 26 years ago, him already graying slightly at the temples. Laura radiant and self-possessed in a simple ivory dress. They looked dependable together, like 2 people who would remember to lock doors and pay taxes on time. A good marriage, people always said, and it was. Which complicated everything. "You shouldn't have called," he said quietly. "I know. Then why did you?" This time, when Evelyn answered, her voice lost its composure for the first time. "Because grief is humiliating," she said. "Because it strips away all the performances you spent years perfecting. Because for 6 months I watched a man die with dignity, and afterward everyone congratulated me for how beautifully I endured it. And all I could think was that there was one person on earth who knew I was not a beautiful person at all. Thomas looked down at his hands. Age had altered them without permission. Veins visible now, knuckles enlarged. The hands of his father. You were never cruel, he said. No, Evelyn replied. I was worse. I was afraid. He stood again abruptly and crossed toward the window. Rainwater slid down the glass in trembling lines. Across the street, a porch light clicked off. There had been another rainy night. Another room. Another version of himself. Evelyn standing beside a hotel window in Montreal at 43 years old saying, if we do this, everything afterward becomes something we chose. He had kissed her instead of answering. Cowardice often arrives disguised as desire. You disappeared, he said suddenly. I know. One day you were there and then you weren't. You were married. That wasn't the point. It was exactly the point. He turned from the window. You don't get to decide what mattered to me? No, she said softly. Only what I could survive. The bourbon burned going down. Thomas realized his heart was pounding hard enough to make him tired. At 64, exhaustion arrived faster than emotion left. What are you doing in Boston? He asked. My sister lives in Cambridge. That's not what I meant. I know. He waited. I found a box while cleaning the apartment, Evelyn said. Letters, old photographs, train tickets, receipts, all the evidence of being another version of myself once. He said nothing. There was a note in your handwriting, she continued. Very brief. You probably don't remember it. What did it say? Come back when your life becomes honest. He closed his eyes. God. He had written that after their last fight. No, after her last disappearance. They had always called them disappearances instead of endings, because endings imply clarity. I was angry, he murmured. You were right. No, I was selfish. You were in love. The sentence entered him like cold water. Not had been, were. As if grammar itself refused to cooperate. Thomas sat down slowly. In the bedroom, the television finally went silent. A click, then stillness. Laura would be asleep now. He pictured her lying on her side with one hand beneath her cheek. She had developed insomnia after menopause and now fell asleep only with old sitcoms playing softly in the dark. 27 years together had made her body as familiar to him as his own reflection. He loved his wife. The fact stood solid and undeniable, and yet there are emotional truths that coexist without mercy. You should let me go, he said. Evelyn breathed softly into the phone. I tried, she answered. Neither moved. The rain weakened. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed steadily, faithfully, like a machine designed to outlast human confusion. Thomas became aware that he was trembling slightly, not with excitement, recognition. That was the terrible thing. Nothing about this felt new. You sound tired, Evelyn said. I am tired. That isn't what I meant. He laughed once under his breath. You always did that. What? Hear the answer underneath the answer. It's because you bury things alive when they inconvenience you. That's unfair. Is it? He almost argued. Instead, he said, probably not. A car passed slowly outside, tires hissing against wet pavement. Then Evelyn asked, very quietly, was any of it real for you? Thomas felt something move through him then. Not memory exactly. Something older, more physical. A hotel room in winter. Her bare feet against dark carpet. The sound of her laughing unexpectedly while he struggled with a broken coffee machine. An argument in Venice so vicious they walked separate streets for 2 hours afterward, both too proud to surrender first. The unbearable tenderness of leaving. Yes, he said. The word came out rough. Yes, all of it. He heard her inhale sharply. For a moment, neither of them recovered. Then she said, almost inaudibly, that's unfortunate. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. What do you want from me, Evelyn? At last. The true question, not why did you call me, Evelyn? At last. The true question. Not why did you call? Not how have you been? What do you want? The silence stretched so long he thought perhaps she would refuse to answer. Then, I don't know yet, she admitted, but I think if I don't see you while I'm here, I'll regret it for whatever remains of my life. Thomas looked again toward the closed study door. A marriage lived behind it, decades, holidays, illnesses survived together, mortgage payments, shared passwords, the accumulated intimacy of ordinary loyalty. And somewhere beneath all that, buried but alive, another life waited with its eyes open. "You can't say things like that to me," he whispered. "Why not?" "Because I'm trying very hard to be a decent man." Evelyn was quiet. Then, with terrible gentleness, "Did it ever occur to you that decent men can still ruin their lives?" Thomas could not answer. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside the study. His entire body went still. "Laura." He stared at the door as soft footsteps approached across the darkened hall and stopped just beyond it. Then came the small, familiar sound of his wife resting her hand briefly against the wood before turning the knob. Chapter 2. Laura opened the study door halfway and looked at him with sleepy concern. "There you are." Thomas turned slightly in his chair, one hand still gripping the phone hard enough to ache. "Yes," he said. On the other end of the line, silence. Laura pushed her hair back from her face. At 61, she had stopped dyeing the silver at her temples. The decision had made her somehow more beautiful to him, though he had never managed to explain why without sounding sentimental. "I woke up and you were gone. I couldn't sleep." She noticed the glass in his hand. "That explains the bourbon." A small smile, familiar, gentle. Then her eyes shifted toward the phone. Something imperceptible altered in the room. Not suspicion exactly. Marriage survives by refusing certain instincts quickly enough, but awareness. "Who is it?" she asked. Thomas felt his pulse behind his eyes. No dramatic calculation arrived, no cinematic panic, only the strange slowing of time that precedes irreversible mistakes. "It's Evelyn." The words settled heavily between them. Laura did not move. For one terrible second, Thomas thought she might not recognize the name. 18 years was a long time. People vanished into abstraction eventually. Former colleagues, dead relatives, old emotional weather. Then he saw recognition arrive, quietly. Of course she remembered. There are names a marriage never entirely digests. "Oh," Laura said. Nothing more. She leaned lightly against the door frame, studying him now with complete wakefulness. On the phone, Evelyn remained silent with astonishing discipline. Thomas stood abruptly. "I should go," he said into the receiver. A pause. "Yes," Evelyn answered, but neither hung up. Finally she said, "Good night, Thomas." He closed his eyes briefly. "Good night." The line disconnected. The house became very still. Laura looked toward the rain-dark window behind him. "How long?" she asked. "It was just tonight." "That isn't what I meant." "Of course it wasn't." Thomas set the phone carefully onto the desk. "She called an hour ago, and before tonight? No contact." Laura nodded once. She entered the study fully then and sat in the chair opposite his desk. The old leather creaked softly beneath her weight. Thomas remained standing because sitting suddenly felt dishonest. "When did her husband die?" she asked. He stared at her. "You knew?" "She sent a note." "What?" "Months ago. A condolence card when my brother passed." Thomas frowned faintly. "You never mentioned it. You never mentioned her obituary." The precision of the sentence landed cleanly. Laura folded her hands in her lap. She had beautiful hands still. Strong fingers. Short nails. Hands that looked capable rather than decorative. "She wrote very kindly," Laura continued. "Said grief rearranges the architecture of a life. I remember that phrase because I hated it a little for being accurate." Thomas sat down slowly. "She called because she's in Boston," he said. "I assumed." "You assumed she'd call?" Laura gave him a tired look. "I assumed unfinished people eventually circle each other again." The rain had stopped completely now. Water dripped rhythmically from the gutters outside. Thomas suddenly felt ancient. Not old, exactly. Something heavier. Like a man arriving late to the understanding of his own life. "I never touched her after you knew," he said quietly. Laura looked at him for a long moment. That is an astonishing sentence. Pain flickered through him. "I'm trying not to lie to you." "I know. No, I mean it. I know, Thomas." Her voice remained calm. That frightened him more than anger would have. Laura had never been theatrical, not in joy, not in suffering. She distrusted emotional displays the way some people distrust salesmen. When did you last see her? She asked. 19 years ago, maybe 18 and a half. And you loved her. Not a question. He lowered his eyes. Yes. Laura inhaled once through her nose and looked toward the bookshelf. You know, she said softly, the strange thing is that wasn't actually the worst part. Thomas looked up. What was? That you became unreachable while it was happening. The sentence entered the room without accusation, which made it worse. Laura stood and walked slowly toward the shelves, touching the spine of a book absently as she spoke. I could feel you elsewhere even when you were sitting beside me. She smiled faintly, painfully. You were very polite about it. You still remembered anniversaries. You asked about my day. You bought groceries. He could not bear the gentleness of her. I was trying to hold the marriage together. No, Laura said. You were trying to preserve your idea of yourself. Thomas stared at the floor. She was right. Of course she was right. That had always been the terrible advantage Laura possessed in arguments. She did not distort reality to protect herself. I almost left you, she said, his head lifted sharply. You never said that? There seemed very little point. You were already suffering. A long silence followed. Then Laura turned toward him fully. Did you want her to leave her husband? Thomas opened his mouth, stopped. The honest answer was unbearable in its complexity. At 45, he had wanted impossible things with complete sincerity. He had wanted Evelyn entirely. He had wanted Laura unharmed. He had wanted morality without sacrifice, desire without consequence. Yes, he admitted at last. And no. Laura nodded as though confirming something privately. That sounds like you. He laughed once under his breath despite himself. Not flattering? No, but true. She moved back toward the doorway. Are you angry? He asked quietly. Laura considered the question seriously. No, she said. I think I'm frightened. The word hollowed him out. Of what? That people remain unfinished even after decades. Her eyes met his. You want to believe age resolves things, but it only makes the unresolved parts quieter. Thomas looked away. In the kitchen downstairs, the refrigerator motor clicked off. The sudden silence felt immense. She asked to see me, he said finally. Laura's face did not change. And do you want to? He could not answer immediately, because wanting was no longer a clean emotion. Wanting now carried casualties inside it. I don't know, he said. Laura held his gaze for several seconds. Then very softly, that worries me more than if you'd said yes. She left the study without another word. Thomas remained motionless in the chair long after he heard the bedroom door close again. At some point, he realized the bourbon glass was still in his hand. He set it down untouched. The next morning arrived colorless and cold. Thomas woke after barely 3 hours of sleep to the sound of Laura grinding coffee downstairs. For a moment, he lay still beside the empty impression her body had left in the mattress and felt an overwhelming urge to become someone simpler. A man with cleaner desires. Someone whose mistakes existed safely in the past tense. The shower did nothing. By 7:30, he was dressed and standing in the kitchen while Laura read the news on her tablet at the table. The ordinary choreography of marriage proceeded around the fracture. Coffee poured. Toast burned slightly. A brief discussion about whether the plumber was still coming Friday. It was almost unbearable. Laura finally looked up. You're buttering the same piece of toast repeatedly. He stopped. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for bread. But her expression softened slightly. Thomas sat across from her. Morning light entered through the kitchen windows in pale strips. Laura wore a navy sweater he had bought her years ago in Maine. One cuff had begun unraveling near the wrist. I could tell her no, he said. Laura stirred milk into her coffee. You could. You think I should. I think there are choices that become defining precisely because there isn't a correct answer. He looked at her carefully. You've thought about this already? I thought about it 18 years ago. That silenced him. Laura took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. Do you know what I realized during that period? She asked. What? That infidelity isn't the deepest betrayal? Thomas said nothing. It's the redistribution of intimacy, she continued quietly. The moment your inner life begins occurring elsewhere. That's what people feel disappearing before they know any facts. He felt suddenly unable to breathe properly, because that had been exactly what happened. Not sex. Not even love initially. Attention, the slow turning of emotional light toward another person. Laura looked out the window toward the wet backyard. I used to listen for your footsteps after work, she said. I could tell whether you'd seen her before you even entered the room. Laura, no, it's all right. She smiled faintly. Time has passed. I'm not trying to punish you. I'm trying to speak accurately. Thomas lowered his eyes. Accuracy. Another thing she valued more than comfort. What happened between you two at the end? She asked. He hesitated. We were in Montreal. For the conference? Yes. She nodded slowly. She remembered everything too. We spent 3 days pretending we weren't already destroying multiple lives. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. Then the pretending became exhausting. And she asked me if I would leave. Laura watched him steadily. I told her I didn't know. And that was the end. No, Thomas said quietly. That was the beginning of the end. The truth emerged more easily now than it once had. Age loosened certain defenses through sheer exhaustion. I wanted time, he admitted. I thought if I waited long enough, the correct moral clarity would arrive naturally. Laura almost smiled. Did it? No. What arrived instead? He met her eyes. Consequences. They sat together in silence. A marriage is, among other things, a long witnesshood. Two people watching each other become gradually more themselves, for better and worse. Laura stood first. I have a dentist appointment at 11, she said, and Ellen's coming by afterward with those fundraiser forms. The normality of the sentence nearly undid him. Laura. She paused. I'm sorry. I know. No, he said. Not historically. Now, he said. Not historically. Now, something flickered across her face then. Fatigue, perhaps. Or tenderness too exhausted to fully emerge. I know that too, she answered. She crossed the kitchen, kissed his forehead lightly, and left the room. Thomas sat alone at the table, listening to the house settle around him. Then his phone vibrated. One message. Unknown number. Though of course it wasn't unknown at all. I'm sorry about last night. I had no right to intrude on your life that way. A second message arrived before he could respond. But I would still like to see you. Thomas stared at the screen. Outside, a wind moved through the wet trees, with the sound of distant applause. Then, before he could decide not to, he typed, Where are you staying?